Welcome, everyone, all of you, to what is our second coalition, and a special welcome, of course, to Felix, Luam, Margot, Nao, and Sam. My name is Bart-Jan Polman. I'm Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the school and curator of the Ross Architecture Gallery. And as was just explained by Andres, central to the public programming of this year is the idea that rather than, let's say, totalizing strategies, what is urgently needed right now is what we call a choreography of dispersed interventions, which we label under the rubric called coalitions. So the programming is really meant to serve as a platform for the creation of alliances. And in the spirit of alliances, this takes on many forms, multiple forms, and tonight's event is one of these, the second of several coalitions. So Coalition 2, the Coalition of Designers, which, as mentioned, is organized jointly with Pinup Magazine. So many thanks, Felix, for that. And these coalitions are meant really as vehicles to bring together people who work in similar sort of disciplinary frameworks and to combine their shared knowledge and expertise around specific forms of practice. So we had a coalition of collectives already, which was our first one, with several representatives of collective practices, and we will have a coalition of curators in a few weeks, and then more coming in the spring. So with that said, I'm incredibly excited to welcome the designers, Luam Melake, Margot DeMarco, Nao Tamura, and Sam Stewart, and of course Felix Burrichter of Pinup Magazine. And just to explain briefly the format, we will first hear from the four designers who will briefly give an overview of their work, starting in this order. I feel we should have used the conveyor belt a bit more creatively, but starting with Nao, then Luam, Sam, Margot. And after that, I'm super excited that Felix will moderate the conversation between them that not only focuses on their work, but also very much, Andres mentioned it already briefly, on New York and the way that New York does, or maybe doesn't, inform all of your practices, let's say. So to better understand, in other words, New York's role in a design ecosystem at this very moment. All of our speakers have incredible bios, which can be found at length online, but just very briefly as a matter of introduction for all of you, and in the order they will present. So now Tamura is a designer whose practice spans product, lighting, furniture, and spatial design. Drawing from both Tokyo and New York's creative cultures, her work explores the balance between nature and technology, emotion and function, and Eastern and Western sensibilities. And she has collaborated with brands such as Issey Miyake, Poro, Artec, and Lexus, and her much awarded work has been exhibited at Palais de Tokyo, Salone del Mobile, and many, many other places. Luam Melake creates handwoven sculptures and furniture using material combinations that reference her interdisciplinary interest in crafts, industrial design, fine art, and architecture, as well as research in the fields of anthropology and psychology. Exploring the psychological impacts of objects is the central focus of her work. Sam Stewart is a self-taught furniture artist and designer whose work resembles and functions as household furniture and domestic objects. He is interested in design that elicits a heightened simplicity and exaggerated satisfaction of looking. And then Margot DeMarco is an artist, designer, and educator based in New York City, and her work exists in many forms, including sculpture, furniture, housewares, video, puppetry, photography, window displays, props, illustration, and writing. And despite working across these disparate mediums, Margot's art contains a consistent thread of shrewd irreverence towards the world of objects. And then Felix Burrichter, of course, is a German-born, New York-based creative director, editor, and curator, best known as the founder of Pinup Magazine, the magazine for architectural entertainment. Trained as an architect here at GSEP, possibly in this room and in the studios. In his work, he blurs the boundaries between design, art, and pop culture, bringing intellectual rigor and camp sophistication to contemporary architectural discourse. So with that, I would like to invite Nao to start tonight's conversation. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Nao Tamura. I am a designer based in New York. I was born and grew up in Tokyo, Japan. And I came here when I was 19. I still remember the day I arrived here. Everything was so almost the opposite of where I grew up, and everything was mixed together. It was pretty exciting. I still remember. So let me go through quickly what I do. This is glass chandelier I designed for this Italian Venetian glass manufacturer called Float. And it was a study of glass and reflection, capturing the light and rhythm of the sea. So the middle part has LED, so you can customize as many as you want. So it's almost like extending the horizon like that. And this is a furniture series that I designed inspired by traditional Japanese garment, kimono. We use a roll of fabric and using only straight line to cut the fabric so that there's no waste. And so I was, what about if I apply that method of kimono making to furniture making, resulting very little to almost no waste. So that was kind of the story behind the product. And this is a portable lamp called Tiki, and it was about playfulness and how design can feel alive. So we launched this lamp during, there's a furniture fair in Milan, and my client placed this in many different places like restaurant, magazine stand, or vegetable stand to welcome people. And like at the park, there's a little bird come to close to you, kind of brings kind of the warm feeling. So I wanted to kind of express that through light. And this is a store designed for Issey Miyake. I'm not sure how many people knows their clothes. Not too much on this picture, but their clothes is it could look very glamorous, but actually if you put it on, it's very comfortable and durable. And I use their clothes when I take an airplane because it doesn't wrinkle. So this space was built around 3 themes: tools, experiment, and process. And this is a flexible plate called Seasons. It's inspired by nature's cycle, and it is a kind of a reminder to live consciousness and sustainable. And these are a little bit of a installation photo. Was the spider web. And this one is a public toilet on tiny triangle space in Tokyo, Japan. And the challenge was safety and privacy. So my intention wasn't to make something just look beautiful and comfortable where people want to hang out. So I focused on the safety and privacy. So I used this color, red, as almost like an alert color, represent both protection and urgency. It's a toilet. You want to know where's the toilet. And the last project is, this was installation I designed for Lexus called Interconnection. And it's about balance between us human and nature. So when you place a pressure on one section, the entire space, the mobile, will be impacted. So my message was, even a small action by each of us could impact this planet greatly. So that was kind of my message, that people who came here to feel it and to think about that balance. So that's it from me. This, yeah, this is, you can move on.
Hello, my name is Luam Melake. I'm a designer and an artist. And I'll give you an overview of my work. I have a background in architecture, and I've worked in architecture and interior design prior to starting my practice, actually at the same time as starting my practice. And I was mostly a materials researcher in those fields. So I've tried a lot of different crafts, and my practice is basically two sides. So one side is handwoven sculpture, and the other side is furniture design. So my handwoven sculptures are made using industrial materials, a lot of them borrowed from building materials. Like this is tubing insulation, for example, and aluminum and epoxy and paint. So basically what I'm trying to do is combine all of the different arts into one thing and incorporate architecture into other structural systems. And that's what weaving is a structural system. And basically the goal is to expand the sort of expressive potential of what a textile can be, and thinking about, like, you know, all of the different arts and how they, and their different forms of expression, are different types of associations that we have with materials, and how those associations play into how we perceive artworks. This is a piece made of telephone wire that was woven on a loom and then sculpted into vessels and then mounted on a board. So it incorporates a lot of different techniques and a lot of different materials from different craft practices. And then this is work by Gerrit Rietveld, who is a huge inspiration for me. I don't know, I was probably a teenager when I discovered his work, and what I appreciate about Gerrit Rietveld is that he was part of the Distille movement with Mondrian and others, and his idea about space is that if you have an object in space, furniture, let's say, it's like a box. And if you have lines that intersect, that don't intersect perfectly, that like sort of overrun, then that box, the edges of the box sort of blend into atmosphere. And for someone who studied architecture and thinks about like space in a very flexible context, this made a lot of sense to me. So thinking about how the objects in space animate architecture is sort of the foundation of my work. So in the beginning of my furniture work, I started in this very Rietveld sort of way, breaking the box, thinking about like how an object can sort of change as your position in relation to it changes, and making objects that can that look different at different angles, or can imply movement without actually being in motion, so that it feels like the room is more animated. And also thinking about how materials can imply movement, just in the way that they're, just in the composition or in the sort of textures of materials. So all of these works are made from layering different industrial materials that are not necessarily for furniture. So from the automotive industry, from buildings, from different ways of sort of layering things that don't belong together to sort of create new types of expressions. So the next phase of my work was really thinking about like, okay, like what do I want to say? Because I didn't really get into it, but my textile work is really, there's always like a sort of message or a theme around the work, and I felt like my furniture work needed something to say. So I'm very anti this digital age that we live in, and I'm deeply resentful that I am forced to adopt its practices. So I was thinking a lot about like design from the 60s that was very oriented towards like changing how people socialize, or thinking at least about like what the future is and how we can sort of plan for that future through design. So a lot of the collectives of that time in Europe were really important to me. Werner Panton's work, Joe Colombo, a lot of the designers in the 60s that were thinking about really like radical ideas about how to form collectives. So it's a completely different context that we live in, because we live in like a loneliness era, an era that's very characterized by loneliness and despair. So thinking about like, can design mitigate today's problems using ideas from the past? So these are more examples of flexible design from the 60s. So this body of work, this piece is called the listening chair. So you see there's like this sort of Rietveld influence of structures and forms that sort of break the box and sort of undulate. But actually it's a soft piece. All of this is a soft rubber on top of upholstery foam. So it allows the body to sort of conform to these very rigid shapes, or for the rigid shapes to conform to the body, I mean. So this was the first piece from this series. So this is called the listening chair. On the left, you see Pietà, Michelangelo, because that's like kind of the most iconic image of someone wanting to heal another person. And then on the bottom, you see Freud's sofa. And Freud believed that like laying down was the most vulnerable position in our lexicon of bodily positions. Because you're the most, it's the most vulnerable position, so you're most likely to confess things when you're in that situation. So I designed a chair basically that allows two people to engage in very intimate dialogue with each other. One of them in a position ideal for confessing, the other one in an ideal position for listening. But then if you're by yourself, you can do all sorts of things from being in this object. And it also allows you to face in different positions in the room, which eye contact is an essential part of discourse. So all of this work is basically about going back to the very foundations of what discourse is. Look at me when I'm talking to you, you know, be comfortable in a position that you can hold so that you can engage with someone, because comfort actually has a lot to do with behavior. So these are other variations on that chair. And here's another piece, Love Seat, in 2 parts. This one's really about eye contact. So a lot of my work is inspired by the field of study called proxemics, which is a field of anthropology that's very relevant to design, because it's about the relationship between distance and behavior and how things change based on that. Like we treat each other differently based on like how much we can engage based on how far apart we are, for example. And actually we intuitively design for this. So this is about situations where it is helpful to make eye contact and situations where it's not, and the types of different interactions that you have, whether you're, depending on how you're interacting with eye contact. This is a piece that was created during the pandemic. It was inspired by the stories about mothers who were tearing their hair out because they had to work full-time and also be the head of the household or take care of children or whatever. So this piece allows for these different types of positions. The one on the left is ideal for screaming. That's like your screaming position, which is actually a position that activates your parasympathetic nervous system to calm you down, and that's why we make that position when we're really upset. There's also opportunities to meditate. 3 people can sit, so people can join, and then there's a groove in the back that allows you to simulate an embrace, because you can't hug in a chair, you know? You have to get up, hug. This lets you hug, or at least feel like you're hugging. So the chair supports you, but also other people in the room can support you with this chair as a tool for doing that. And then here's another sort of pandemic one called the regressive chair. And I say that because it's like designed for the fetal position, which I don't know about you, but I found myself in that position a lot in 2020. So this sort of allows for that. It also allows you to simulate a one-arm embrace. And it really does feel like you are hugging someone. But it's also a shelf, so you can use it for that. So this is the next wave. So I have a show that's opening at the end of January at R & Company in Tribeca. And This show's about the future and about innovation in America, and I have like this really elaborate thesis about that I'm not going to go into right now. But right now I'm really inspired by designers who have taken sort of the ideas of tradition and sort of rendered them absurd by incorporating innovation into that. So here's, and also pop artists who have taken familiar objects and also rendered them absurd in the context of the gallery. So here's one example from the show, and I'll end on this. This is the Lazy Boy chair. It was invented in 1929, and it kind of is like recognizable. It was like an iconic big development. They basically invented the recliner. And then you see an ad from 1955, and then from 2005, and then 2025, and like, actually it hasn't changed that much in like 70 years. So this to me is a really good metaphor for where we are in America right now, which is that we're not really moving forward in terms of innovation, where things feel like they've stagnated, and in 100 years, the chair does the same thing, and it was a really good idea in the beginning. So the next show is going to be imagining, what else can we do? What could a lazy boy be? So this is my imaginative idea for what it could be next, which is a recliner still. It has that functionality. It's a 3-piece set. So you can put your remote and your snacks on one thing and have an ottoman still. Inside of the piece is a crazy quilt, an antique crazy quilt from 100 years ago. Which I've also painted on top of and manipulated. And then when your friend comes over, you have a second chair from that thing. So basically, this is going to be the next show. Please come and see it. Thank you.
Yeah, when I moved to New York City in 2011, I had no plans for my future. If at that time I had an idea of what a designer was, it was likely formed from something I'd seen in a movie or on HGTV. All I knew was that I was going to need a job. My girlfriend's mom, Francie, a lifelong New Yorker, recognized something in me that I hadn't. She said, "Sam is an artist. I'll get him a job working for my friend Barry." And so on her recommendation, I went to work as a freelance art handler for Barry Friedman Gallery on 26th Street in Chelsea. The gallery specialized in 20th century art and decorative design. Although my job as an art handler mostly involved installing, moving, and packing, I quickly began to develop an interest that went beyond the basic job requirements. So I began to pay close attention to the materials and forms of the works that I was like physically handling. I would borrow from the gallery's vast collection of books and auction catalogs. I went to other galleries in the neighborhood and lunch break and Thursday night openings. But eventually, not really keen on being an observer only, I grew to believe that I could try my own hand at designing and making, which was maybe a folly at first. But so working at the gallery, although it set me on the course that I'm on today, it was one of many similar jobs. I also spent a number of years driving around delivering and installing artwork in private homes as well. If I look at this kind of cumulatively, I think that the biggest kind of, benefit that I got from this was from working with other artists that were working as art handlers. So I met a community that, like me, had to work to support themselves in the city and, more importantly, to support the pursuit of their own art careers. So, the art handler-artist relationship is a bit like, in New York, it's a bit like the actor-waiter in Hollywood. And I think in some ways the art handler-art relationship is potentially more fraught in a way because you're the one kind of wishing that your work was being handled and not the other way around. So I kind of had to be careful who I spent time with. Some were kind of resentful of the success of their peers, and others, were more disciplined and inspiring. So I kind of took to the latter. Um, and in my opinion, no matter what you do to provide for yourself, and especially in New York City, there's a kind of balance, I think, between, or a sort of tension between the sort of fantasy you have for your life and then the kind of necessity that the city requires, like paying rent and putting food on the table. And I think that's really important. So yeah, it's the model that I learned to adopt from others that were older or had more experience here. And I think it allowed me to grow and mature at a nice pace, in the city, when sometimes you feel like you're being kind of swallowed up. So the other half of this is something that's a bit harder to tie down, less formulaic, is kind of the exposure to all the beautiful kind of hidden in sight details in New York. So when I had a day job, particularly the one where I was driving around a lot, always on the move, walking, I started to notice a lot of these details in the city. And so, whether it's the kind of landlord architectural intervention, the temporary construction sites, just undefinable stuff on the sidewalk. If you're looking in New York, you're going to see some things that might inspire future work. So yeah, and I wanted to mention too, another part of that driving around and going to all these different neighborhoods was also seeing all the different manufacturers in New York, and so that's been a big part of my work. I don't make every single thing. I don't upholster, and I'm not an expert in metalworking or anything. So I would find places where I could have an idea, and then meet someone that could help me realize that idea. And these are not always easy to find. A Google search doesn't always end up with the right person. So in a way, always being kind of running around, I was able to find the right people, which I'm sure there's some luck there as well. But I wanted to kind of end this talk with kind of with an example of what I'm talking about, specifically to do with like noticing something and how that kind of comes into my work. So I actually think one of the slides, if we go back, is, oh yeah, I can do it myself. Look at that. I think this actually relates to this. Yeah. So these are what I called night lights, and I'm going to kind of tell you the story about how those came to be. So the New York activity of parking can lead to an idea if you're willing to look. A few years back, I was living in Ridgewood, and I was driving pretty long hours in a delivery van. I'd finished my route after most people in the neighborhood had parked already. So my options were limited, and instead of looping around endlessly, I decided to start parking along a rather deserted industrial strip on like Flatbush Avenue, which was about a 25-minute walk from my apartment. And so I started to notice on these walks that you couldn't, especially in like Ridgewood, Queens, you couldn't really distinguish one of these like tan brick townhouses from the next, except through the awnings that were on the front. And specifically the color and the form, it seemed like each person who owned one of these townhouses had done their own unique awning, but the rest of the building is pretty much identical. And I also noticed that they weren't terribly functional because I lived in one of these, and it didn't protect you very much from the rain or from the snow. But I started to take photographs, and I liked the look of them, and so I kind of saw them as architectural scale equivalents of like the plug-in night lights, like in your bathroom, like grandma's house or whatever. And this led me to making a series of these lights, basically like somewhat quarter scale, but that's not like the formula. I just kind of did what felt right. And as sconces, they hung, on interior walls, and they were sort of disembodied from the like the architecture or the building or whatever, and I kind of like that. They become more almost like personified. So, you know, I guess to wrap this up, you know, I was kind of surprised in a way when people resonated with these, and I think in a way, you know, some of the work that I make like this is something that other people have maybe noticed as well. And in a way, I'm not doing anything like profound. It's just like reminding people that I saw the same thing, and maybe they were parking as well. But yeah.
So I make a lot of different things in a lot of different areas. So I tried to spread it out as much as I could. But starting with this project, this is, I wanted to show a little bit about my background before I sort of was working as a professional artist and designer. I grew up in a very silly community art milieu in Seattle in the 90s. There's this event called the Fremont Solstice Parade that my mom and extended family organize, and it's this very special event where it's all DIY, people making, you know, costumes and silly things. It's all human powered. There's no advertising. There's no motor vehicles. And my early life was really focused on this parade, making things for it. And I try to bring that same sensibility in all my work, both in kind of the lightness and the silliness, but also in like the freedom. In the way I make things, I try to be kind of unconstrained, but I also like to make things that sort of inspire a little bit of freedom in how you interact with things and how things look and behave. So let's start with, this is probably my most traditional design, industrial design project. It was a product that I put out with AreaWare maybe 8 years ago now. It's called Pinch Clip. It was a wooden carved bag clip, and I wanted it to look like a drawing, but also to have this, you know, clever, you know, gesture of like pinching with your hand, obviously. But something that's been a thread through a lot of my work is kind of the life of the objects we make, that they have a little bit of spark of life in them, because I do kind of think of the objects we make as our offspring, as like our children, and as like these things we've created that live in the world, and they're designed to work with our bodies. They're shaped like our bodies, and so I think there's a spark of us in all of our products. These are these doorknobs that I made, a limited number of them. They're these hand-carved doorknobs, same kind of idea of bringing a little bit of life and silliness. This was a product I did with a brand called La Puzz. It's a puzzle company, and they're puzzle box holders. So when you're working on your puzzle, you wedge it between the layers of the sandwich. So ever since I was a design student, I was trained as an industrial designer at CCA in the mid-2000s, and I've always had this conflict within myself that I love stuff, I love design things, I love, you know, the world of objects, but there's this weight to making things because of climate change, because of landfills, because of trash, because of plastics, because of all this stuff. Everything that the designers make ultimately ends up as trash. And for a long time, I really was held back by that. I felt like I couldn't make things because they would just end up as trash. And so in the last few years, I've really embraced that, and I've been using trash and using found objects as kind of like my main material. And, you know, part of what I love about that is, you know, sustainability is such a buzzword, but I think a lot of people forget that, like, you know, recycle is the third R. It's reduce and then reuse and then recycle. And I think a lot of times recycling is a way to just make things out of plastic and call it eco because it's melted down from other plastic. But really a lot of energy goes into melting that plastic and making that plastic, when we can really just be exploiting the current materiality that these objects have and using them as they are and reforming them. So these are vessels, they're vases and pitchers and things. It's this ongoing series I've been making that it's collected trash, both my own trash, things that I find, recycling, different things, and then covered in paper mache, which is just a simple mixture of cornstarch, is about as non-toxic as it gets, and brown paper grocery bags. And I use a lot of cardboard as well because I think that's kind of the, like, in addition to trash, is kind of the ubiquitous material of our time with the Amazon takeover and such. And then they're finished with beeswax. These are another sort of series with this reused material. The series of clocks I made. I like to think about, in our minds, we sort of intellectually know that the plastic stuff we make will last for hundreds of years, thousands of years. But what is it actually going to look like for this piece of plastic to exist for 10,000 years? And so there's this ongoing kind of thought experiment that I've been doing, which is like, what if this plastic has now grown into its own life form? It has like merged with other organic materials and has created these new kind of new life. So that's kind of this ongoing theme of these trash carved organisms. This is a similar one, but it's a shelf, sort of a domestic object. I wanted it to kind of look like stained glass, but it's got these pieces of trash and plastic embedded within it. These are a series of, this object is pulled from a series of vessels that I've made that's with packaging. So using packaging as a mold, a single-use mold. So I will form, multiple blister packaging together and stitch it together with like silicone and zip ties and things, and then use cement to fill it to make a new sturdy object, and then finish it with carved wood. This was an installation I did at a wedding a few years ago. It's all collected, plastic bottles that we spray painted different colors, and then there's just LED tea candles that are zip tied in place. I really love zip ties as a material. I love the directness of them, and I think they look cool. So with that same theme, I made a few short films that were puppeted by me. You can see on the right, I buried myself in this sort of industrial wasteland in South Brooklyn that I found that was a really beautiful place. And it's that same idea I was saying earlier, where it's, what if our trash has now lived for thousands of years and has become these sentient life forms, and they have this deep malaise because even though they were designed to work in concert with humans, a water bottle, its shape is fit to our mouth, fit to our hands, but this is thousands of years in the future and there's no more people around. And so what is this malaise that they have? So there's these dialogues between these trash puppet creatures. This was a stage I made at MoMA PS1 a few years ago. It was around the same time that the Pinch Clip came out, so I wanted to kind of pull from that same language, but it was just a fun, playful stage. The fidget spinner actually spun. It was built around a ceiling fan. This is a recent project. For the last year or so, I've been working as a production designer for Telfar. A lot of my work, in addition to making things, is pulled into kind of fashion photo shoot set prop world, because the realities of being an artist and designer in New York is you have to be kind of scrappy and catch work where you can. So I've been working as a set designer and production designer for a long time, in addition to my design work. And this was probably my favorite project I've done, which was for the brand Telfar. They had their 20th anniversary show a few months ago, and we rigged up these clotheslines that went up like 8 stories. It's a nod to the immigrant history of New York, but also kind of exaggerated, a little bit surreal, but also kind of poetic. This was a costume I made for them last year. It's their sort of iconic bag, but remade as a mascot. This was for their store. We made these invisible mannequins that was a way of showing off the clothes. So I also do a lot of work on photo shoots and different production things, and so this was a music video that I worked as a prop stylist and production designer on. You can see all the little details that go into little shots. This was a mouth I made that was quite fun for a Miley Cyrus Dua Lipa video a few years ago. This was for a Zara photo shoot, just a mascot character. This was I think it was on Instagram or TikTok cooking show that someone tried to get going, and it's all made from paper mache and also found objects and things. And I made these characters and different food-related things. It was supposed to be a spaceship, like a cooking show set on a spaceship. They were like lost in space in a food nebula or something. This was a window design I did for Brooklyn Fair grocery store in Greenwich. I wanted to pull from the neighborhood, you know, the wrought iron gates, but bring in a little bit of like food and whimsy. And this is also made of paper mache. This is sort of a part of an ongoing series I have made that I called Bloopy Doopy shelves. You know, they have that same kind of organic organism feel as some of the other work, but I also like the kind of practical functionality of it, where they all had these multiple tiers of curves to them, which is actually, it looks kind of silly, but it's actually sort of practical because a lot of shelves are for little objects and things, and it makes a little stage for them to be nestled in nice ways. This is an older experiment, a way of sort of playing with the surface. There are these cutouts in the tabletop, similar to what we have done here, but there was a stretchy mesh stretched across the surface. This is another older project, just playing with kind of expectation and vernacular, and you know, what's a clever way to have a lamp installed in space. And then just ending on this kind of silly project. This was a typeface I made called Inscrutable Regular. Each character was just a scribble, but the orientation and kerning and all that stuff was built into the font so that they overlap and make all these crazy patterns and things. That's it. Thank you.
Felix, please. Yeah.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, Nao, Luam, Sam, Margot, for this diversity in practice. I think, you know, going from very classic, well, not very classic, but classic industrial design to, you know, prop styling and everything in between. I think there is I mean, during the introduction, it was mentioned that Pinup, which is the magazine that I started, the subtitle is Architectural Entertainment, and it was always a sort of the idea was that not to look at architecture and by proxy design as a monument, but to look at it as a social practice. And I think what's really fascinating about all of your work is how it is embedded very much in the social ecosystem of New York City. And to have this also happen at Columbia University, which I was told I think this is the first time that there is a panel of only designers. I think there was the exception of Virgil Abloh, maybe, who was here, who did a single presentation. I think this is the first ever panel of designers speaking at Columbia University, one of, I think, probably the most New York university there is. So I think what I would like to start with is how I was talking about this embeddedness in New York and in the social infrastructure of New York. How did you get here? Because none of you are from here, I think. And what influence has New York had on your practice? Now. You already mentioned it a little bit. You came here when you were 19.
Like I said, I grew up in Tokyo, Japan, which is very different. Like I said, it's almost the opposite of New York. People are quiet there, people are polite. The streets are very clean, nobody's screaming, people are not eating food outside on the street. And so, but at the same time, I learned how to kind of communicate in New York City. Before, when I was in Japan, I didn't learn to speak up. You shouldn't, like in school, you shouldn't speak up, unless teacher told you to speak up. Here, you have to kind of express yourself, otherwise you don't even exist. So I learned like through design, I don't expect you to understand what I'm doing. So I'm trying to communicate what I'm trying to do, or sometimes it's a client work, what client trying to express through design. So New York is a big part of that kind of a communication skill that I didn't learn back in Japan, which is still now, it's a big part of my communication, is a big part of my design work. My answering your question.
So would you say that New York to you is a source of inspiration, or it's more of a constraint?
Yeah. It's everybody's expressing themselves, and it's a very rich, inspirational place for me, as a designer.
To break up the order a little bit, sorry, Sam. We have you mentioned you came to New York in 2011.
Yeah.
But you recently left.
I did.
And you moved back to, I don't know if it was back, but you moved to North Carolina.
Yep. To my hometown, yeah.
And maybe you can tell us about your work in New York, and a little bit more how you came here, and also what motivated you to move to North Carolina.
Yeah, so I came here in 2011, and I did not have any kind of plan or any. I was dating a girl in college at a small liberal arts school in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she grew up in New York, and she was like, "Do you want to come to New York?" And I said, "Yeah." And then, tale as old as time. But yeah, when I got here, I kind of had like the perfect situation, because my girlfriend's mom, who I mentioned in my talk thing, she was like just like the most classic downtown, renovated her loft in the 70s, was still paying like a crazy low amount, all this stuff. And she was like kind of part of the art and design scene in Soho, like going back in the 90s. And so she was like, "Sam's an artist. I'm going to get him a job with my friend Barry." And I literally went the next day to work for Barry Friedman, who's, I think now still kind of like privately dealing, but he's up there in age. But that was like, it was total chance. I didn't study design. I didn't know anything about design. I probably knew who Frank Lloyd Wright was, but like that was it. And so when I worked at the gallery, it was like a whole world opened up to me, and the auction catalogs were just like stacks and stacks, because I think it's like a little bit on the earlier side. I think everything's been like mostly digitized now, but like every auction house sent out these catalogs, and I learned a lot from those about design, little images, and then actually physically handling the work. That was a big thing. Like I remember assembling, because a lot of their work, like if they did an exhibition, it might be someone who's still living or like sort of contemporary in the design world. But then, we would have like private viewings, and I would have to assemble like the Memphis, Milano designers. I remember assembling these like Andrea Bronzi metal shelves with like, almost look like firewood, like spaced between, like kind of holding everything up. And I don't know, just like having that proximity to the work was like, it kind of weirdly gave me probably false confidence, but also like it wasn't perfect. You know, like when you see it in the auction catalogs, it's like probably edited a little bit maybe, I don't know, or like it's like small enough to not see the details, but like, I don't know. I mean, I would see like, you know, Satsa's stuff like really up close and the laminates were like a little off. And I was kind of like, this is real stuff, you know, made by real people and designed by people that existed. And so yeah, I had the idea. I was like, I'm gonna do this. Like I can do this too, you know? And so I kind of just slowly started. You know, I was working in like the crate shop at the gallery. I think Mark, so it was Barry Friedman and Friedman Benda Gallery. And I'm gonna expose myself here a bit, but I would work in the crate shop on the days off. There was like a director at the gallery who would let me come in, and I still don't think Mark knows about that because it was like a huge liability because I didn't actually work for him. We just had a shared like basement space. But yeah, that's kind of like, it was weird because I'm like, I'd step out and there'd be like whatever Wendell Castle or, you know, whatever. And then like I would go in the crate shop and work on whatever it was. So yeah. then
13 years in New York, I
yeah,
think.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to leave something to appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I
think
I wasn't trying to like fulfill that kind of maxim necessarily, but a lot of, you know, things in life happen. I mean, to be very real with you, like, you know, a failed relationship, an apartment building that was sold, and my landlord was like, you know, everyone out. And I was kind of at this point in New York where I felt like I was only working to like pay my bills and my overhead. And I was like, I need to kind of restart. And I was like, what better place than home? So I think that's another part of my work that I like didn't go deep into in the talk, but like I've always kind of been very flexible about what like space I work in. I've gone through periods where I had no physical space to work, and then that ended up like influencing a lot of work. You might have seen like the bread chair. Like at that time I didn't even have a studio.
I was hoping we would get to talk about the bread chair
Yeah.
because I don't think that was clear from the slide that there was an entire sofa made or a chair made out of bread.
A lazy boy, actually. I called it loaf, which is a really bad joke. But yeah, so yeah, that happened in a period where I had no physical studio. So I had like this, I wanted to make, you know, I'd had studios, but it was just like I had no money, and I kind of had to take a step back. And I was working a kind of full-time job, and I just was like kind of in the headspace of like, what if we do this? And then kind of working with manufacturers, and you know, that kind of brought in a new element to my work where I was like, I don't have to make everything. So I think like I really expanded materially what I was doing at that time because I didn't have to be an expert in baking bread. Like I worked with Josh and Jess Pickens, who are amazing bakers that I met through Layla Gohar, who was the other half of that chair project.
And the lazy boy was eaten at the end.
It was eaten, and this was January 2020. So yeah, I thought a lot about that. That happened, and I did another show of these, like one of which I think you own, which is the they're almost like shaker bonnets, but they're made with like traditional like pleated lampshade fabric. So I had that show, which was like a mask, and then I had the super spreader event, and yeah, it was like kind of felt like I was foretelling something, but yeah, that was it was eaten mostly, yeah.
Luam, will you tell us?
So I always loved New York. I came here for the first time on a school trip in the 8th grade. We did like a History of America trip, and I was like, this is the place. I love this place. So then I found excuses to come here once a year, and actually that was kind of this was the only place that I went to museums. I wasn't raised with high culture. So I would come here, I would go to the Met, I'd go to MoMA, and I'd be like, whoa, there's this whole world of things. And I was always into art and design. I mean, even as like a small child, I did a lot of things. Like when I was 15, I learned AutoCAD because I wanted to design cars. And then I found out that's not art, that's engineering. And I was like, okay, never mind. I took painting classes at a community college. I designed clothes. I knew how to sew and to knit and to do all of that stuff. I took a lot of different classes and like learned a lot of different things. So I didn't know how to, like what that meant, like what kind of career I was gonna have. So I decided to study architecture. And weirdly, when I graduated high school, I got a letter from my former self graduating middle school that I didn't remember that I wrote. And in that letter, it said, "Congratulations on getting into Berkeley to study architecture." And I was like, weird. That was my idea in middle school too. So anyway, it was like, I was obsessed with Berkeley. I really wanted to go there and be this wild bohemian and study architecture at a school that had a very interdisciplinary approach to architecture. But I think around my second year of school, I realized that that architecture just wasn't for me. It's too collaborative, it's too big, it's too long term, and I kind of wanted something smaller that I could control. But I did really like the functionality of architecture, the structure of it. Like I liked a lot of elements of architecture, so I got this idea, I should be a furniture designer. And I was like maybe 19. I had no idea how to make anything. I didn't know what furniture design was. I really knew nothing about furniture design. So then I became obsessed with it and just like learned everything I could about furniture design. And I started taking classes in woodworking and Japanese wood joinery, which is like really big in the Bay Area. And I started working at William Stout Architectural Books, which is basically like a huge repository of books on design. So I learned a lot of different things from that. I basically learned about the history of design from working at that job. And then I stayed in San Francisco for a while. And then, you know, all these tech companies came in. The real estate got crazy expensive. And just like, I don't know, the culture of the city, just like there's something demoralizing about living there and trying to be a creative person. So I was like, you know what? It's time for me to move to New York. That's the place anyway. If someone knows how to be a furniture designer, they probably live in New York, and I'm going to go find whoever that person is. So I moved to New York. And, you know, for all the things that people say about how hard it is to live here, I was like, this is a piece of cake compared to recession era San Francisco. Like in 2 weeks I had a job, I had an apartment. I was like, you know, like an animal that was in a cage and was now free. I was staying up late, going to clubs and like going to movie theaters and doing everything I could, and just really thriving on the stimulation of being here. The other thing that was really exciting is that there's so many jobs in design. And the things that I wanted to learn, I could learn on the job, which was not possible in San Francisco, and it didn't feel possible. It's probably not that possible in a lot of places. So I just got jobs to learn the things I wanted to do, and then took night classes to learn how to weave at FIT, which is where I learned how to weave. And then I took night classes in different furniture design like elements of furniture design. And gradually, I just like learned how to make a lot of different things. And I was also the director of a design gallery called Demish Danant later. And yeah, so I learned about the industry from that job. And then I learned how to make so many things that I was sort of like knew a lot about materials. And then I sort of like told people like, I could do like just materials research for you. And then I started working at Studio Sofield. And then just like things just started, rolling from there. And then I had a portfolio, and then sent it. I talked to people in the industry and was like, help me. What should I do? How do I do this? And I don't know, just got some advice and applied for a residency at the Museum of Arts and Design and randomly got it, even though I had no artist CV at all. Like, that's one of the things I love about New York is that it's not formal. The culture is just like, people feel you out and they're like, I like the cut of your jib, like come work for me. You know, it's very like this sort of natural relationship oriented process of like doing things, which is not true in places where things are actually more competitive because there are fewer opportunities. So I just found this place to be so freeing, even with all the constraints that are, you know, famous, like it's expensive and blah, blah, blah. I just find that you can really choose what kind of life you have. And I feel like I'm in a very specific niche, and it probably wouldn't have occurred to me to do what I do now if I hadn't been here. I definitely think I would not be doing any of the things I'm doing now if I didn't come to New York.
I moved to New York because it's the greatest city in the world, and I continue to feel that. We were chatting earlier, and we all moved here in 2011, so 15 years in, and I still feel that way. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Early in New York, I was pulled into, similar to what Sam was talking about, kind of the like art handler world, art assistant world, and at that time, you really realize the simultaneity of New York, that like it's not any one thing. There's not one art world, there's not one design world, there's not one anything, and you can really find your niche and make it happen. And I was working for this kind of millionaire vanity artist, and like just seeing his little art world that like was buying and selling art for tens of thousands of dollars, but no one's ever heard of any of it, and just kind of the absurdity of all of that, and then getting tapped into kind of fashion world, which is, ridiculous. And, I always reference Devil Wears Prada, that like, it's actually like worse than that. Like it's just like that, but even more extreme. But also just like how all these resources are at your fingertips, and like, even if you're a billionaire, you still walk the same streets, and like, it's a big city, but it's also a very small city. And like, if there's something cool, everyone wants to go there, and it's just a really infinite field of possibilities. And even though it's the most expensive, it's also, you can do so much for so cheap. And so much of my work is scrounging and collecting materials, and there's just so much junk here that gets thrown away. There's so much, you can mine, like working in photo shoots, working in sets and stuff, the amount of waste is just like diabolical. Like, dumpsters full of stuff just for one photo shoot. And just being able to like, I had a car at the time, and just load up my Forester to the brim with like strange objects and cut them up and reform them. And yeah, just, so much of my inspiration comes from just walking around and looking at things, like similar to what you were saying, Sam, and it's just infinite. And seeing the city change so much over the last 15 years, but also like the change is what makes New York, like, on one hand, you can see like the cool things dying, but it's like, that's always how it's been. That's always how it will be. It's always going to be changing and growing, and it's the best.
I hope we're going to get back to New York a little bit later on. But I would like to talk about with you is scale and spatial thinking. And I think the relationship between architecture and design is very much a spatial coalition. But I think that the way, from an architecture perspective, the way objects are being, or furniture, functional objects are being thought of as an extension or a sort of supplement to a space. I think in many of the cases, the way you work is, the sort of the object, maybe not in a vacuum, but is a sort of as a singular entity. Whether you get a commission from a brand or from a company, or for a photo shoot, or even something like a shelf, or from a private client, or if you design something for a gallery show. What's your relationship to space when you think of an object?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think it really is the context, right? Like, I always think about like, a painting, like, is ultimately furniture. Like, most of the time they're going to be sold and put on someone's wall, and like, what it has one meaning when it's in a white wall gallery where you can stand and ponder it, but like, what does it mean when it's over someone's couch? You see like a graphic, brutal painting, and it's going to live in someone's kitchen or something. And so I like to think of the venue as like kind of in conversation with the object, like either to juxtapose it or to feed off of it, or a lot of like I didn't really show much of them, but a lot of like sort of lighting interventions I've done and different installation things. Like, I like to work in a very direct, ad hoc kind of way. Like I mentioned, I love working with zip ties. Like, I love pulling materials from my surroundings, but also like rigging for my surroundings and making it work. Like, you know, when I think the best example is that Telfar installation where, you know, there was all these meetings about like how it was going to work and all this and that. And it was like, there were these renderings that were like all these complex renderings. And it was like, I just took a photo and drew a bunch of lines and was like, let's just wing it. And like, you know, go up on the scissor lifts and see where the hole wants to be, where the flow wants to be. Like there's a gap here. Let's like run a line there and just energy, just feel it out. Just like the flow.
You would just go knock on everyone's door in these buildings?
I mean, we sort of got permission, but there were all these like loops that were just out on the outside of the buildings. And so we just had these 2 scissor lifts and we were just like, I was like, okay, we're going to go there. And we would drive the scissor lift over and just zip tie it on and then be like, okay, this is going to go down there. And you would just kind of, you know, go for it.
Now, how does it, for example, when you're approached by a company like Poro, what part of the conversation does the idea of space come in versus materiality or the object itself? And I'm referring to, for better understanding, I'm referring to the bench.
When I think about object, whether it's furniture or lighting or actual like store or toilet, I think of not too much the architectural space too much, and more I focus on the people, how people move within the space, and how people interact with the space rather than you know, physical space itself. So so I guess my approach is more people in the space and the object comes in that space kind of approach.
Often, you know, I think this is sort of industry standard, especially for the, you know, when working with brands like I said, Poro or similar brands, often Italian brands. You know, you have the object sort of isolated, silhouetted, the silhouette image, and then you have the object photographed in situ, in the space. Are you, to what extent are you when are you involved in that process, and can you influence that? Do you?
You know, that's a good question. It's the joy and the fun part of being industrial design. A designer is you design something, and sometimes you do suggest the photo shoot what the product, you know, the product should be in certain space, but a lot of times, like the stuff that I show today, the very old, antique, almost like a castle background, and my product is super modern, minimal. The juxtaposition is really interesting, and often you launch product and like magazines, they use product and they create another kind of art piece using my work. So it's always a joy to see that afterwards. So I try not to, I like to leave a little space for people to use their imaginations. It's a very simple thing, like the stuff that I did, Poro, was very interesting. Each media, magazines, they interpret it in a very different way. So it was very a fun thing to see.
Luam, sorry. How would you describe your relationship to space?
Well, as I said in my talk, I think of design objects as a way of animating architecture. But for me, the challenge is that I don't know where these pieces are going to go. So I'm sort of like designing for like what if situations. So sort of the goal with the chairs is at least 180 degrees of like being able to like look this way, look this way, look this way, look this way. So that like no matter what situation a person is in, they can engage with someone in their space regardless of where that person is, what that space looks like. So sort of like planning for different alternatives, I guess, a universal sort of space, I guess, is what I'm designing for. And then thinking about like, if this were in this room in my apartment, like how exactly, where would I place it? How would that make sense? So I guess I'm thinking more about humans in relation to each other in a space, which makes sense because that's what, like, my work is about proxemics, and that's really what that field of study is what I've learned from that field of study. But also just like thinking about like new relationships with space between like the object and the person. Like those pieces that I showed earlier, I didn't really get into it, but some of those pieces, like the color changes and the texture changes depending on your relationship to the light in the room, for example. So if I had the opportunity to design commissioned work, then it would be a very different situation. Like in my interior design work, I'm very like conscious of existing space. But in this work, I have to think a lot more generally, which is actually really fun. I think it's actually more interesting to design for a space that doesn't exist, that any space this thing could work in, potentially. That's kind of the goal. And so the architecture kind of doesn't matter, but it's also the most important part at the same time.
Sam.
So the relationship to space, I mean, I think, I do a lot of commissions, like for individuals, kind of. They're not really interior design, I guess, because I generally go into a space that's like already done, and I don't know, people have like, say if it's a table, they have chairs or whatever. So like, I mean, sometimes I take into consideration the space, but other times I just don't, you know? I mean, I have an idea for something, and obviously if it's like completely off base, I'm not gonna like be like, hey, this should go in your place. But like, it's a bit of a negotiation, I think, between what I wanna do at that given moment.
I want to say at this point, though,
expecting.
knowing all of your work very well, because in various times working together on pin-up and other things, there are, in your work, Sam, you also do, over the course of the past 15 years, you've done a lot of built-in seating, you've done architectural elements like doors.
Yeah.
I think...
Yeah, a lot of built-ins. That's true.
A lot of built-ins,
yeah.
And that is something that completely transforms
the
space that in a way that you would traditionally think of as more architecture.
Yeah, and I think like, so maybe the space that I work within, I guess, in relationship to the architecture is like a more intuitive one, because again, like I think I can pretty quickly like look at someone's what generally is a pretty vague need, like I need a door here, or I need this or that, and it's like one time, I mean, I did a job where there was like some kind of like in the wall of this apartment there was like a utility box type space, just like an opening, and so in order to fill that, I ended up just having like I did a drawing of like a mouth of the homeowner, and she had like a really nice gap between her teeth here, and so I did a drawing of that, and then I had it laser cut like in plywood of just like teeth, and then mouth, almost like a Wesselman painting, you know, like very like pop art. And then I went and found this guy in New Jersey who did stained glass, and so I put like a light inside of there, and then like it glowed, you know, and kind of illuminated the stained glass mouth in the wall. And so like that's like, it was just like, yeah, that's what needs to go there. But I think like it often, like, it might start a little like wacky, but I think I really try to attempt to make it fit in an elegant way. You know, like when I tell that story, it sounds like a crazy thing, but it really didn't. Like, I don't think you would even notice it necessarily as like what it was. And so I think that there's a way to kind of like sweeten the deal a little bit, you know. And I think I do a good job at that, kind of without really having to put a lot of thought into like the architecture of the space. I can just kind of be like, this is how I'm going to treat this problem in a way.
There is this concept of, Joe Ponti, the Italian mid-century architect, famously referred to architecture as from the spoon to the city, from the object to urban planning, and there's this sort of ambition of universal practice as architecture. Is there also a sort of reverse effect for you, where you, to some extent, feel like you're not bound by an object, or you want to expand the practice in a way that is, that also finds that connecting moment between the disciplines? I mean, considering also where we are right now. Okay, well, I gotta choose. Let's start with the architect.
Yeah, so my objective with my work is to collapse as many disciplines into one object as much as I possibly can. So I feel like my work, I learn principles from architecture and apply them to design. I incorporate, techniques from painting, from like sculpture. I mean, you'll see with the next body of work especially, it's like really like maximizing the sort of interdisciplinary character of an object. But even in my woven, or very much in my woven work too, I'm like borrowing different craft techniques. I learned all these craft techniques and then I just decided to apply them all, like throw them all into my woven works because they're non-functional, and so I can get away with sort of practicing and doing casting and pouring and doing like different types of techniques and merging them into sculpture. But to me that's very important, because I think like material culture can't move forward if disciplines stay isolated, and especially design, if it's just form, function, and materiality, and we're staying with the same materials and we're staying with the same functions, then I think we've reached the limit of how far that could go in a way. Like like from now on, it's just personal expression really, unless there's like a more rigorous sort of intellectual basis or site specific, or something that makes it different from just like a shape and a function. So that's that's what I'm really interested in exploring. And for me, it's like a chair has been something that you sit on. Why can't it be more? Why can't it do more? And a chair fixes you in one place. And it's been the same thing for hundreds of years already. That was the point I was making with the lazy boy. It's like, how long are we going to have the same things around? Because actually so much of how we live has really changed, and I don't think that that's really taken into account in mass culture especially. Like, for example, since 1971, multi-generational homes have quadrupled. So we live in like multi-generational situations. Because of unaffordability, we live in smaller, more temporary spaces, which means that furniture has to adapt to like different places that we relocate to. And our spaces change. They need to be multifunctional. Like there's a lot of things that like could change in design. And I think like if we take a more analytical approach to like how we live, especially in the mass market, I'm really talking about that. Then like without an analysis of where we are presently, then we like can't get to the next phase. So so what's the next modernism? That's what I'm thinking, is like what comes after this period? Because I feel like we've been here for a while, and now we need artists and people, thinking like everybody here about like what the next thing is.
Margot, what is the next thing?
Next thing, I don't know. Unfortunately, it's JPEGs. I mean, I guess to what you were asking earlier, like, I think I feel kind of plagued by being a multi-hyphenate person, because like, if I figure out a technique I like doing, or like if I if I sort of get something dialed in to where it's like working, then it feels kind of stale and I have to like move on from it. Like, and I almost feel like the best work I do is when I'm like distracting myself from the project that I'm supposed to be working on. And I think being a person who makes lots of different things, I can always jump to something else if I'm like annoyed with whatever the thing I'm working on.
But is there a scale that you have not
Oh, a
been
scale?
able to, yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess I definitely would like to work larger. I have a dream of opening a funky campsite. That's kind of my
what?
a campsite,
Oh, okay.
like a sculpture garden campsite. Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to work larger. I think I do default to working kind of smaller because in that way I was saying where I make the best work when I'm distracted. I often just end up making things for my apartment. And it would be really fun to go big. I mean, it was doing that installation with the coat hangers was really inspiring because it was, 80 feet high, and it definitely made me want to go big.
Now, you already showed some, I think one of the projects, the public bathrooms in Tokyo,
Yeah.
was spatial design or
Yeah.
architecture. I mean, without wanting to be too literal by, and cordoning off the disciplines. Where do you plan more of these sort of projects, or where do you see the place for these sort of projects in your practice?
I think Mark Newson said designing a pencil and designing a rocket is the same thing. Sometimes I do think like that. Like I often control like 0.1 radius to 1.3 radius, and then you get project like toilet project you were talking about a lot. Sorry. So I think the approach is the same, but like the toilet project, it was actually it was interesting project. 16 architects, and, including designers and creative persons, worked on each land in Shibuya. So, but I would say 80% was the Japanese architect, like some of them are big, Ando, Tadao Ando, and Toyo Ito, and all those big architects. But somehow I got, I'm not an architect, and I never done, architecture, and they asked me to do something. And I think it was good that they mixed the discipline, and that's why maybe architects would think about structure and material and the scale of the building, but my approach was based on my experience with public toilet when I was a little high school kid, and when I lived in Japan, I felt not comfortable. I felt fear, and I'm sure I'm not the only one felt that way. So my focus on, again, people's feelings and people rather than the, larger scale. So I think it's good to mix the discipline, and there's a lot of more unique possibility born that way, I think.
Thank you, Felix, for moderating this, and thank you to all of you.